So I have Lisa Wang, also from Republic, but previously, you started SheWorks.
Yes, I
Now
did.
now SheWorks is this community for, women who are entrepreneurs. What gave you the idea that that was needed? And then you sold just a month ago to Republic, which is this crowdfunding environment for entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs get their companies funded by everyday investors instead of accredited investors. So how'd you get started with SheWorks?
Yeah, well, so SheWorks is the leading global community of about 20,000 female entrepreneurs, and our mission is to help close the funding gap and get women funded. And
So can I ask sorry if I interrupt.
yeah,
Uh, when you say it's 20,000 female entrepreneurs, is
yes,
every woman in SheWorks an entrepreneur? Is she running a business?
mostly, yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, or part of a startup.
Okay.
Yeah, and most of the women in the community are actively fundraising, usually in the pre-seed or seed stage. And SheWorks started in 2015, and
How'd you start it?
really, it wasn't. It was in some ways an accidental company. I had no intention of actually starting a company because back then I had launched a late night munchies delivery startup during
I
the whole on-demand wave.
okay, I wanna tell you, I did my first late night munchies delivery startup in 1987, 88.
That was when I was born.
There you go. So I
You're
precede.
ahead of the
But
times.
we didn't succeed. But okay, so you started that.
Yes.
What were you selling?
We did a it was one touch delivery, so it would understand what your favorite late night snacks were. It would learn that, and we would work with a select number of restaurants. And after they closed or near the end of their shift, we would order just one particular dish from them, so they didn't have to have extra staff on board, and they were basically making additional revenue with people who were able to order in. But the reason that's connected to SheWorks is because I went to Silicon Valley for the first time to fundraise and was really excited because I had heard about how awesome Silicon Valley was. And in one of my first investor meetings, I walked in with my 35-year-old white male COO, and the investor walks over to him, shakes his hand, and brushed me off as the assistant.
What VC was that?
Uh, not gonna
I'm
say.
just kidding. I knew you were not gonna say.
It's actually an angel, but um, the experience itself, I think just in that particular moment left me a little bit shocked. And I had come from the Wall Street world, so I'd been at a hedge fund in my first job out of college, and so I wasn't necessarily unaccustomed to being the only young female in the room. But I think it's very different when your startup is, your blood, sweat, and tears, and your baby is on the line, and someone just thinks you're, just the helper who's on the side. And,
But I've been through that. I tend to think, whenever you're the younger, less experienced, less known person, that happens. That happened to me when I was 30 and going to investor meetings for a startup I was doing.
sure. I think in this particular case, it was less so about being young and more so about being a woman.
How come you think that?
I think that because this is a very prevalent experience, now if you're a, 26, 20 something, 30 something year old male in a hoodie wearing sneakers, you're almost always the person who's addressed
Hmm.
as the founder. And
So, like, if you were starting a company right now
yeah,
and you brought in, like, your tech guy, who's wearing a hoodie, but he's like a white man, do you think he would be the one that the investors would assume was the head of the company?
not anymore.
Mm.
I think, the experience back then is that's what I experienced at that point in time. And so since then, obviously it's been a number of years, and my philosophies about life have also changed, as well as how I think occupy a room. And at the end of the day, I always think that I really value this idea of full responsibility, and that's you take full responsibility for wherever you are in life, whether that's financially, mentally, spiritually, who the people in your life, like people who continue to victimize their situation as a result of, their gender, their race, their, class, or whatever it is, whatever you were born into. I think if you want to get to a place, it's your full responsibility to make that happen. no matter what the external circumstances are. And so now, your question of if I walked into a room and no, because I think I've learned how to carry myself and I have enough value and respect for the experiences that I've had that I don't think people would assume that I'm the assistant. No.
So I 100% agree, and what would you say how do you you use the phrase, "How you occupy the room." Like, how what do you do differently in terms of occupying the room that you didn't do before that you would advise people to do? Like, how does one come in and occupy the room to assert yourself to the fullest?
I think it starts before you come into the room. I think it starts with mentally I honestly think it starts from the moment you wake up and look in the mirror and what you say to yourself. So, if we are talking, across gender lines in general, one experience I had was actually, with a male founder friend of mine. He had said to me one day I asked him about his morning routine, and he said, "Well, every day I wake up and I look in the mirror and I look at myself and I say, 'You're gonna crush it.' Like, 'You're gonna make that money.' And I know I will, and walk outside, and every time I see my reflection, I know I'm gonna make that money, I'm gonna crush it today." And I said, "Oh, wow, that's really interesting because when I look in the mirror, I see that one hair on my eyebrow that's, like, not perfect enough." And so that was a few months ago, it was earlier in this year, and it just struck me how he genuinely thought that to himself in the morning, and from that moment, I started thinking, "How do I get to a point where I can look in the mirror and I also just am unapologetically confident and happy with what I see looking back at me?" And I would say that I am finally at that place. It's taken me
But
30
how do you do
years
it?
to
Like,
get
it's
there.
just practice?
Um, I think it has to do with I know this is a common theme now, but self-care, for lack of better term, because for my entire life as a elite athlete, as a straight A student, basically all these check boxes of really high achieving things, um, I never I never did those things necessarily for myself, and I would hustle and I would work myself to the ground and I wouldn't eat properly, and especially as an entrepreneur, I think there's this idea that you should sacrifice yourself and your sleep and your health for your company, and I did that for a period of time, and I think that that also reflected in how I walked into a room when I just felt run down and tired and like the world was against me, those lows I really felt, and even if though I felt those highs.
And I think you're right. I think there's a very big danger with what I call entrepreneur porn that you have to like hustle 100 hours a day and kill yourself doing it. I think you're right. You need to put the best foot forward, and that means you have to conserve your energy in a variety of ways, and you have to present yourself well. I'm not even saying in terms of how you're dressed or whatever, but just in terms of you can't be getting sick while you're running a company. There's no point in it.
Yeah. I mean, it comes down to fundamentally, if you respect yourself, other people cannot help but respect you. And so if you're not taking care of yourself, you're not respecting your body or anything else or yourself as a leader. So how can anyone else take you seriously? And yes, you could fake it till you make it, which I really dislike that term because I think it makes it seem like you can just pretend and like I don't know, not work. But for me, everything that I've done is because I've just worked my ass off to get there. And I think when I got to a certain point and I started to understand that my mom was right all these years, that, it was just focus on what you eat, focus on getting good rest, and don't get sick, and exercise enough, but not too much, and just, have those boundaries up. And interestingly, people always say, like, well, I don't have enough time. And now that I've actually, especially I think after the acquisition, I've been focused on really clarifying the next steps. But I don't think I've ever been more productive than I have in the last few months, nor simultaneously felt as physically well, um, as I have in these last few months.
And connect this to how did you start SheWorks? You said it was started by accident, and
Yeah,
you were describing, yeah, this
yeah.
lunchy delivery service.
Yeah, so, that experience, I think, was, tied up in a few other experiences that I had while I was in Silicon Valley, and the I had a lot of male founder friends at that time who could share this story with, but I didn't feel like anyone could truly empathize with what I'd gone through. And I'm not someone who um, enjoys going to, let's say, female only events where a lot of them at the time were just focused on problems. And I think in some ways, there are still a lot of those spaces where it's problem focused rather than solution focused. So really, it just came out of a place of I wanted friends who could empathize with my journey. And when I came back to New York, I got together a small group of other female founders, and we really focused on sharing stories and also who were the investors we want to connect with. What were the possible solutions in terms of getting our foot in the door? Because really, the biggest problem is women just aren't invited to, the boys' drinks or whatever gatherings there are, and so if you don't have that initial in, that makes that first meeting across the table a lot more daunting. So, yeah, from there, it was that just first few meetings, and, I started cold emailing a number of top investors who I think it's always easier to email people above you on behalf of others, especially
Mm.
if you're a woman, and so it was for a larger cause, and, that night after the first meeting, I actually went home and I wrote down, values of the community, I wrote down the types of people who I thought could fit the mission, so this is actually something I think a lot of startups don't do until much later on, and they're like, "Oh, shoot, now we have a culture that we actually have to build, and wait, we don't have values." So for me, it's always like values first.
Well, in part, though, what you ended up the equity value you created was the culture
Yeah,
as opposed to a
exactly,
product or something like
exactly.
that. So you built up, like, this community. So you wrote emails to investors. You had, I guess, emails or connections with founders. How did you bring it all together into a community?
Um, so the yeah, we started I think the first thing is you just need to get one person to say yes. And so we had brought in some of the first people who came in was Dane Atkinson. He was the CEO of Squarespace, an angel investor. And from there, we brought in partners from various funds. But I think a lot of it was the ability to position as there weren't any female entrepreneur groups back then. Really, that were focused on funding, and this is really a recent development that there's been so many female
And when you say
initiatives.
focus on funding, you were bringing in these investors to take a look at handpicked companies that you were selecting that were female
Not
founded.
exactly. So one of the things that I thought was wrong with the way that typical investor meetings were is that they are purely transactional. And it is, here's my company, let me pitch you and sell you, and you decide the fate of my company. And what I wanted was, well, I wanted to build relationships and I wanted to help female entrepreneurs connect on a meaningful level with an investor without feeling like they had to transact on the spot. And so the focus was really on education. So the investor would come in, I would put a spotlight on them, and they would come in and talk about their investment thesis, what they were excited about, and then it would always be a specific topic, like um, how do you structure your fundraise? Or
And when you say you'd have them come in, you would have conferences
it was
or
it was
online,
roundtables. So it was 30 female entrepreneurs,
like
25
in
to 30
Silicon
female
Valley?
entrepreneurs in New York.
Mhm.
That's where we started. In New York, and then we started doing those every single week, every Wednesday morning, and did that consistently for I don't even I want to say 100 weeks or so. And part of that, consistency was what made it become a staple of New York City is because female entrepreneurs would start hearing about it word of mouth, and they're like, "We just know every Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. in the middle of the week, there's this extremely inspiring and educational and tactical gathering of other women like me where I get access to someone that might take me years to get access to." And so it was this unprecedented access that we were bringing in a really friendly way that gave you a voice at the table, but didn't give you pressure if you weren't ready yet.
And what other services did you offer, women to be part of the culture and the community?
Yeah, so we have an online community. We started doing summits. So summits were some of our bigger events, and those brought together anywhere up to about 200 female entrepreneurs, and we'd bring in between 30 to 50 investors, funds, angel investors, family offices. And it wasn't one of those like just come in and network and try and find the people with the blue badges and the red badges. In advance, we got all the information from the investors about their investment thesis, and the types of companies, stages that they were interested in, typical check size, and we made those available to the founders so that we said, choose what table you want to sit at. And so, there was no randomness to the tables where, people were sitting at, because you would obviously choose an investor who is probably invested in your industry. And there was a specific format of the discussion within the groups where we really said to the investor, "You're here to facilitate and to help." So, typical roundtables, people will have a problem and everyone will say, "You should do this and you should do that," and there's a lot of shoulding. And so, the format was really about asking clarifying questions, giving suggestions, being additive, rather than, someone being like, the investor was just another participant at the table.
And how many companies, do you think got funded directly through connections or interactions they had at one of your events or
Um,
in your
I
community?
mean, dozens even in the first year.
Mm,
So I think one of the first ones that was pretty publicized was we helped the 14th ever African American female founder raise $1 million. So her
what was the
she
company?
It was called Court Buddy. It is called Court Buddy, and it's a legal marketplace. And she met her lead investor, a white male lead investor, at our San Francisco summit. And from there, he led the investment round and was able to bring in a couple more investors who were at our summit, to close out that
And
round.
how's the company doing?
They're doing great. They just closed their Series A.
Oh, really? Well,
Yeah.
what do they sell?
So they are a marketplace that brings independent lawyers, gives independent practitioners, a place for individuals to be able to access them. So right now, it's obviously legal services are very expensive, and there are independent practitioners who might offer services that others might need, but if you're an individual, you might not be able to find each other. So they
Ah,
basically
got it.
help make that accessible.
And what do you think makes a good community? Let's say I wanted to start a community of X. What makes a good community, do you think? A good online community? Like here, there was kind of this ultimate incentive that somebody might join your community and as a result, directly or indirectly, get rich. And that's a strong incentive to be part of the community.
Yes. Well, the main thing I think people should recognize is that every community is a reflection of its leader. And the result of that is, I think the leader has a lot of responsibility to do an immense amount of self reflection, to understand what their own values are, the way that they show up, the way that they speak, the way that they interact, their energy. Um, I think that's probably what I've done the most work on myself was, really understanding what my triggers are, when, inevitably there's gonna be negative feedback from the community, and so understanding, well, how do we always bring this back to my highest self and the values?
How do you bring
Um,
that back?
well, I
Because I
th
find I have negative feedback sometimes for things
yeah,
I do, and it's hard.
yeah. So our 3 values are ambition, action, and altruism. Ambition is the idea that you dream bigger than anyone says is possible, because you're gonna get a lot of people who say you can't do it. Action is that, you not only dream, but you actually execute. And altruism, is the idea that it's your duty to give back to each other and to the next generation of women, because that's the only way that we all rise. And so I think that one of the things I talked about earlier was full responsibility. I talked about the full responsibility pledge, and when I see people who, it's very clear when sometimes people blame others for their problems, which I think is also one of the main reasons why people are unhappy. And, uh, I think when that's the case, it's really about, okay, well, how do we lead them back to what their original vision is versus like, "Oh, here's this, little challenge and, like, you have to solve it for me." How do we, bring someone else who might be able to hold up a mirror? That's the thing. I think for me, what I like to do best is, um, I consider myself a coach in many ways. As a gymnast, I think I trained with so many coaches, and I love doing that mentally with people. is, the responsibility of a coach is really to hold up a mirror to the person who's sitting in front of them and say, if they're complaining and they're reacting and they're is to ask a question back and say, well, notice like what really is the root of the problem? Like why is this really an issue? And so I think patience is a big thing, and just not reacting immediately to whatever external stimuli is coming
Uh,
towards you.
now you've sold to Republic, fairly recently in the past few months. Probably can't talk about the deal, but was there cash in stock or cash or all stock or
Both.
okay, so congratulations. And what I would think about if I were you is you have all these sessions, all this content between VCs, investors, and entrepreneurs, and back and forth questions and things that you've probably learned and the community has learned. I would almost make a book of all the you have so much valuable content that millions of entrepreneurs and female entrepreneurs can learn from. And I like this idea of uh shifting from blame to action, which I think is important. I think that's the danger of any community that's doesn't perceive themselves as the top community. There's a tendency to blame.
Mhm.
I think
Well,
everybody has a tendency to blame no matter what,
yeah.
and then just some people have more tendency than others.
I've already created an online course called Fast Track Fundraise. So that is a 8-week program that really anyone, but it's particularly targeted towards female entrepreneurs because there is a segment on how to counteract sexist questions when you are inevitably asked those.
Like, what's a sexist question?
So there's a Harvard Business Review study that says over 66% of the time men are asked potential promotion questions and women are asked prevention questions. So an example would be a promotion question would be like, "So tell me about your milestones. Like, tell me how big the company can get." And a prevention question is, "Do you really think you can get to 100,000
Mm, mm.
users? Don't you think that a competitor who already has raised significantly more money will come in and enter? Like, how would you even
That's really
stop that?"
valuable to know the difference between the 2.
Yeah.
So it's protection versus
Promotion
promotion
versus
versus
prevention.
and that women tend to be asked more, prevention questions.
Yes. And it's hiring too. It's like, who do you have in your pipeline versus how do you think you can build this product if you don't have a CTO yet?
Mm. And so I wonder if even without the VC asking these questions, I wonder if the female founder could benefit from knowing this information. So to think in terms of promotion versus prevention. So
Yeah.
whenever you get that anxiety, they're like, "Oh my god, do I am I gonna make the launch date or whatever?" Think in terms of the opportunities that every failed opportunity, gives birth to.
Yeah. So I actually have 2 frameworks that I share, around how to deal with it. I mean, the first thing is, yes, like the awareness. So like, knowing that you will get asked these at some point in your fundraising journey, and the first thing you have to do is you always have to create enough space between the stimulus and the response for you to recognize this. And so when you recognize it, there's something that I created called the SET frame, SET frame. And so it means that whenever you get a question, you always redirect it into either your strengths, your experience, or your team. So it's, if someone asks you that, you just talk about how you've like your unique strengths will help do this. So then you focus on the strength. You focus on your track record and your experience and how obviously you would be able to do this, and then just your team, your ability to network and bring in the right people and do that with confidence.
What's the best way to network? I always have
Um,
a hard time with that.
yeah, I think the best way to network is to go in with a clear knowledge of what you would like to offer other people. I think that most people go into a networking situation thinking about what they can get. And it's always good to know, upfront, like, here are some of the challenges and the areas of need that I have in my life. But I think when you are interacting with someone, realizing that everyone is living in their own reality and like couldn't care less about you really until you've established that connection. And if you're the person who can start off the conversation by really asking something beyond, "Hey, what do you do?" But you know, th- things that really get to the human aspect of who they are and what they're really passionate about and connect with that core part of them and then seem genuinely interested in what they're doing if you actually are. And I think when you're curious and you're genuine and people sense that, they're more likely to open up, share with it what they might need help with, and you can share what you need help with.
What
So
was the community of that you built up, were they excited about being acquired by Republic? Because now there's access to the platform where not only VCs and big angels, but, the crowd essentially can fund their companies.
yeah, yeah, I think it's really exciting. I've heard from so many of the entrepreneurs in the community who are excited about it, and, we've launched the She Works Equity Crowdfunding Challenge powered by Republic. So, there's obviously an onboarding cost because they, offer a lot of comprehensive help, for female entrepreneurs who or for entrepreneurs generally who want to create a campaign. So as part of the challenge, we're giving, the winners the opportunity to create their equity crowdfunding campaign with all of those costs covered.
Well, and how's life since the acquisition? You're staying at Republic?
Life has been great. So I'm an advisor in Republic right now. I am actually launching a new venture, and so it's really
So
uh,
fast? Is Republic happy with that?
a new venture that I think will help everyone, including Republic.
What's the new venture?
So I'll talk about my new mission. But the I will always be
How are you
helping.
gonna prevent losing all your customer no, I'm just kidding.
Um, yeah, so for me, I think a lot about, my strengths, and I I I know that I'm a really strong storyteller. I know that I'm really great at, reflecting and helping other people reflect on their own strengths and their challenges. And, I think we're living in a world where, obviously there's only 2 types of currency. There is money and attention, which is essentially financial capital and social capital. And I think in the past, it used to be that financial capital was enough to create whatever influence or impact you wanted, but increasingly we see that social capital, which is both social influence and social networks, can actually be more valuable, perceived as more valuable than financial capital because of the effects that it can have. So, I feel like I've spent this time working on part of the financial capital piece, creating equity there. And in the social capital piece, what I noticed is that there's the quote unquote influencers, and these are there's a bad rap to it because we think of influencers as people who shamelessly self promote. And I coined a term called social leaders. And social leaders are people who leverage social capital, social influence, social networks to create meaningful social impact on society. So they're leveraging their personal brand and personal story for a higher purpose. And so those are the people that I want to help support and get their voices and stories out there because I know that there's a lot of people who are doing great impactful work and they don't want to be they're like afraid of the spotlight, they don't know how to do it. And I think those are the people whose voices need to be heard.
That's interesting. Can I tell you one quick story?
Yes.
So in 2006, 2007, early 2007, I was promoting a company, and one of my partners was Jim Cramer, who has the TV show Mad Money on CNBC, and he's known as like a big investor and so on. And so he was telling me all the time, "You need to go on CNBC. You need to go on CNBC." And I'm like, "Oh no, I like to say behind the scenes." And CNBC kept calling, and I would not even pick up the phone, and I wouldn't return their calls. And Jim Cramer came up to me and he was like, "You're James, you're embarrassing me. You're not even returning their calls. Like, why would you do that? Go on CNBC." And I said, "Oh, I'm not promotional. I don't want to." And he said advice that I've always paid attention to ever since. He said, "If you don't promote yourself, nobody else is going to." And so that stuck with me, that people have to feel like they can promote themselves in order for other people to want to promote them as well.
Yeah, and I to add to that, I would say that, a lot of people are uncomfortable with self-promotion because of the narcissism that it implies, and, I like to say it as, your story and your experiences, like, that's already happened to you, and so it's no longer yours to keep. What a true leader would do is leverage the stories and experiences, no matter how painful they are, to empower and inspire and motivate the people who your story now belongs to, right? Because now your story becomes a tool. And so it's if you have a message that you think could help others, I think it's the most selfish thing to do to try to keep it in and be afraid to look at it. And it's the most selfless thing to be able to face that pain or whatever it is that you dealt with and give it to others, to support and help them.
Well, Lisa Wang, founder of She Works, this has been so much advice. I'm trying to figure out how I'm gonna steal some of it for future articles and books. I'll try to give you credit, but who knows? And, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's so exciting.
Thank you.